Welcome to the 4sight Health Roundup podcast. 4sight Health's podcast series for healthcare revolutionaries. Outcomes matter, customers count, and value rules. Hello again, everyone. This is Dave Burda, news editor at 4sight Health. It is Thursday, March 16th. First, I want to extend my condolences to the family and friends of Gary Bisbee. Gary was the founder, chairman, and CEO of Think Medium, and the co-founder and former CEO of the Health Management Academy. Gary also was a founding member of this podcast, which debuted in April 2020. Gary left the show in November of that year to form Think Medium. That's when Julie Murchison, partner at Transformation Capital, replaced Gary as our regular guest expert, along with Dave Johnson, the founder and CEO of 4sight Health. Gary passed away unexpectedly on March 10th, and our thoughts are with him, his family, his friends, and his many colleagues, including myself. We'll miss him. Gary taught me a lot about healthcare, but he didn't teach me anything about banking or the digital health technology market. And that's what we're going to talk about on today's show. As you know, the big financial news this past week was the collapse of three banks: the Silicon Valley Bank in California, the Silvergate Bank in California, and the Signature Bank in New York. To explain the healthcare ramifications of these bank collapses are Dave Johnson, a banker, and Julie Murchison, a digital health technology expert. How lucky is that? Hi, Dave. Hi, Julie. How are you guys doing this morning? Dave?
I'm in mourning for Gary Bisbee. Gary has been a close friend of mine for a very long time. I wrote a substantial tribute to him on Tuesday that's available on the 4sight Health website, so I won't belabor the topic. Suffice it to say that the world is diminished by his loss, and like you, I send my condolences to his family and very large circle of friends. Godspeed to us all.
Thanks, Dave. Julie, how are you?
Well, I just came back from some road warrior activity, walked into a house with COVID, so that's really great. But I don't want to miss the opportunity to chime in with Dave. Working with Gary was like working with no one else. And it's amazing the number of people I've seen on the East Coast over the last couple of days who were just stunned. So it's, he was a big guy and will be a big loss.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Thank you. Now, before we talk about bank collapses in healthcare, it's also National Patient Safety Awareness Week. Now, there's something to celebrate. Dave, give me your best patient safety tip for patients based on your healthcare experiences.
I don't know if it's my best, but it's certainly my most entertaining. When I was about to go into surgery several years ago, another patient was using a black magic marker to write right and wrong on his thighs to make sure his surgeons operated on the proper leg. Simple but effective safety tip.
Yeah, that'll snap you out of anesthesia if you see that. Thanks, Dave. Julie, play patient advocate. What's your best patient safety tip?
I like that one, Dave, because it's simple. Mine's a little bit more serious. I don't think people really understand that if you go to a specialist or a surgeon or anyone probably other than your PCP who you're going to for a specific procedure, like ask how many times do they do this procedure a day, a week, a month compared to others across the region, across the country. It's amazing that if you actually ask, and how do your patients fare? What are the outcomes? They have no idea how to answer that, right? So it's not necessarily what the answer is, it's how they answer it.
That's interesting. That is a great insight. Mine would be, don't be afraid of seeking a second opinion. We avoided 2 unnecessary surgeries because of it. And I would recommend treating your doctor like you would treat your car mechanic, or maybe how you treat your banker. Now, the only thing I know about banking is what I learned from It's a Wonderful Life. The Bailey Building and Loan took in money from depositors and loaned it to people to buy homes. When all the depositors wanted their money back, the bank got in trouble, of course, with a little help from Uncle Billy and Mr. Potter. Dave, you're generally pro-market versus pro-regulation, and you're generally pro-market versus government bailout. What's the lesson from these bank collapses for healthcare, given the serious financial struggles of many hospitals, health systems, and medical practices? More or less regulation, fail or bail?
Let me correct you slightly, Dave. I am pro-market versus pro-business. And I believe we should have, quote unquote, Goldilocks regulation that's not either too tight nor too loose, with the goal of enabling level field competition broadly in the marketplace. Regarding bailouts, I'm generally against them, as you say, unless a lack of government intervention poses a systematic risk to the financial system or the economy overall. Proper regulation is a blend of art and science. It's hard to get exactly right. That's why we're seeing the Fed struggle with appropriate monetary policy as it tries to cool the economy and tamp down inflation without sending us into recession. It is a difficult and delicate undertaking that embodies taking calculated risk. Indeed, the aggressive interest rate increases by the central banks around the world, including by the US Fed, was a contributing factor in stressing the balance sheets of the now failed Silicon Valley and Signature banks, as well as the struggling First Republic Bank. Credit Suisse Bank has also seen its stock plunge over worries about its solvency. A $50 billion cash infusion orchestrated by the Swiss central bank has restored market confidence in Credit Suisse, at least temporarily. The situation is fraught, Dave. Moody's downgraded the entire U.S. banking sector from stable to negative this week based on a deteriorating operating environment for banks. The kind of runs that you were describing from It's a Wonderful Life. Investors continue to withdraw funds despite the government's dramatic rescue plan announced last weekend to guarantee depositors investments above the federally insured $250,000 threshold. Many depositors, particularly in the tech sector, are scrambling to rearrange their banking relationships to reduce their financial risk. Julie, I'm sure you've gotten even more emails than I have, but I've gotten several from companies over the last week providing updates on their banking relationships. That's certainly unusual. Let me make a couple other points before quickly answering your healthcare question. I mentioned investor confidence a moment ago. Markets collapse when investors lack confidence. That's why the language of banking has an almost religious quality to it. Trust indentures, bond covenants, pledge agreements, promissory notes, guarantees, etc. First point, regulators act to encourage proper market function and always worry about overreacting and creating moral hazard. Moral hazard is my favorite economics term. I just like the way it sounds. It happens when economic actors increase their risk levels without bearing the full costs of that risk, like when governments bail out banks for bad investments. Moral hazard encourages heads I win, tail you lose market behaviors. When Hank Paulson was Treasury Secretary during the 2008 financial crisis, he allowed Lehman Brothers to go bankrupt because he was worried about moral hazard. He felt compelled to send the message that the government wasn't prepared to bail out every failing financial institution. That turned out to be a catastrophic decision as the financial market seized up and the government had to take even bolder action. Secondly, unlike 2008, 2009, this is not a too big to fail situation yet. In 2018, Congress lifted some of the Dodd-Frank regulatory requirements from medium-sized banks. They're the ones struggling now. The nation's biggest banks still undergo regular stress testing and must maintain plans for addressing potential insolvency. Turning to healthcare, though, I am worried about the long-term sustainability of the hospital sector in the U.S. At some point, this sector may require government-orchestrated restructuring like the auto industry did in the wake of the financial crisis. But health system administrators should not take comfort in this. They don't have the freedom to engage in moral hazard. While the healthcare system overall is too big to fail, no individual hospital or health system is big enough to avoid insolvency if its operations sputter. Indeed, any government-led interventions would likely involve downsizing the nation's acute care footprint and shifting resources into community-based health networks. For healthcare incumbents, the only way to avoid this type of financial reckoning is to shift operating focus to generate higher value services. In Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, one of my favorite books, one character asks another how he went bankrupt. His answer was very slowly and then all at once. We're getting ever closer to that all at once moment for many incumbent healthcare providers.
Dave, you are healthcare's George Bailey. Great job.
At least I get to go on vacation.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's great. Julie, any questions for Dave?
Well, Dave, you noted that we're waking up to the news today that First Republic is likely up for sale. Stock is plummeting. And this Credit Suisse news, which, is a bank with, 5 times or more of the assets of Silicon Valley Bank, is getting a bailout. And it's totally, I should say not entirely separate, but pretty separate issues. Just really poor timing, but probably very similar systemic problems, right? So what's your take on just the psychological impact of where we're headed, forgetting, the realities of some of these specific situations?
Well, I think psychology is everything. Everything the regulators are doing right now is to restore market confidence, to prevent the type of bank runs that we saw last week at Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, and get everybody to think about things other than where their deposits are being held. But we're not out of the woods yet. So the psychology is really, really important. And it does feel like the central banks around the world understand this and are doing everything they can to restore stability to the banking system overall.
It's interesting because I'm going to see my mom later today, and we'll see if she wants us to take her to the bank and we'll draw her money. That'll be the test.
That will be the test. That is a good point.
Julie, how do you think the bank collapses will affect funding for digital health tech companies and the pace of healthcare market innovation, given what Dave teed up for you?
Well, what I found this week in my travels and discussions about this is that there are a large number of people outside of the innovation realm in healthcare and who don't live on the West Coast or from a major finance hub, who don't actually really understand what SVB's model was. So there's a lot in there that, has to do with your question, Berta. And if you just look at it, a couple stats, or maybe just one, 12% of SVB's 173 billion in deposits came from life sciences and healthcare. I would bet, I didn't look for the stat, a lot more of those are biotech companies than they are digital health companies. Now, a lot of digital health companies banked SVB, don't get me wrong. But SVB was almost made for biotech. Biotech companies take on a lot of debt. They go public even before making $1 of revenue, so before commercialization. And SVB was made for this. So I think many anticipate that the impact on biotech will be much higher than digital health or novel care services, even though there's certainly an impact. One thing is for sure. Venture debt will be much harder to get, period. And SVB started in venture debt and grew all sorts of other corporate and personal banking services over the years on top of that. So, for companies that are relying on debt right now, and certainly in a period of massive growth, but use that as a part of the funding vehicle, there are a lot of big questions out there. These innovative companies this week have now been forced to diversify across other bigger banks like Bank of America and Wells Fargo. Some even put their money at First Republic, which is humorous. At those big banks, little innovative companies have a hard time getting attention. And they don't have access to the same kinds of, service vehicles that they did at SVB. And they won't get the same level of credit. Those banks are just not as founder friendly. And that's frankly what made SVB so great and what's making a lot of VCs in the Valley turn towards trying to kind of save it and make sure that save it or make sure there's some sort of replacement that really does cater to the needs of innovative companies without the risk. That's not what they're going for. Now, on the investor side, sure, a lot of investment firms bank to Silicon Valley, but that's kind of been dealt with. And people might be a little spooked for sure, but I'm not sure that's going to stop investors that have capital from deploying and investing. And it may actually help valuations even more in the next 9 to 12 months. So, I worry less about that than I worry about the confidence on the buyer side. This could just be an easy button for end customers like health systems, like health plans, life science companies, employers, et cetera, to have a bit more of an irrational reaction to the health of innovative companies and point to this as another risk for engaging with them. In many ways, we haven't really seen that yet, but time will tell. And I just have to say, everybody's talking about it. And so many people have come up to me in the last couple of days, really trying to understand it. What does it mean? What's our perspective? How are we impacted? How are companies impacted? So I see a lot of people really who either really get it or are really trying to understand it.
That's interesting. Using it as an excuse not to innovate. There's a new one. Thanks, Julie. Dave, any questions for Julie?
Julie, our government came to the rescue of depositors at Silicon Valley and Signature banks with balances greater than the FDI insured amount of $250,000. They're also providing incremental funding to bolster deposit protection for banks that require it. Are these good uses of the taxpayer money? Kind of gets to your question about psychology. And perhaps more importantly, and more in your area of expertise, have the digital and biotech companies learned their lesson about the importance of diversifying where they bank?
Well, these bailouts are a little bit different, or I would say materially different than the 2008 bailouts. They supposedly are costing $0 per taxpayer as it relates to covering those deposits. And that's because they are saying that the bank's fees and the bank itself will ultimately end up paying for those. And what that means is the shareholders of those banks are going to suffer. Where in 2008, those shareholders made money on these federal bailouts. So regardless of the specifics and the details and the decimal point of what that really means, because of course, taxpayers are paying the FDIC to orchestrate all this, that's an important difference. Second part of your question, yes, I guess, have they learned the lesson of diversification? I guess I would ask Dave, like, how many banks do you bank with? Like, do we think about the need to diversify our banks as part of our personal strategy? Like, I don't think that many people in the country even have that luxury, much less, people who think about that as something that's important to do. They're doing it now. I will definitely say that. And they're going to suffer for it for all the reasons I just talked about earlier, that most of the banking models, are likely larger. They're going to larger models that are less interested in what, the smaller company needs are.
Mm-hmm. Those are all great points.
Yeah. I just thought, we go to the bank that we go to because it's closest to our house, right? That was the number one
criteria
reason to go there. Right. Interesting. And I'll also say everyone hates rules and regulations, except when they need rules and regulations to save them from themselves. And that includes patient safety. Now let's briefly talk about other big healthcare news. Julie, what else happened this week that's worth mentioning?
I can't say that much else happened this week that I've really been tracking, but on a bright note, I will say that our friend and colleague Rushika Fernandopulle, who started Iora Health so many moons ago, is leaving or has left Amazon and is thinking about his next adventure. So keep your eyes on Rushika.
Yeah, well, we'll follow that. Thank you. Dave, what other healthcare news should we be talking about?
Yeah, go Rashika. What a great guy. Anyway, as has been widely reported, Microsoft and OpenAI have been beta testing their new version of ChatGPT. It's called Prometheus. In Greek mythology, Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans. This is an apt name for this more advanced generative machine intelligence tool. That's a mouthful. I was given access to Prometheus by Microsoft last week and have started experimenting with it. It makes ChatGPT look like a toy.
What are you asking Prometheus, Dave? May I ask you? Well, why don't you ask Prometheus where you should bank?
Right,
there you go.
Right. I did ask it how broken is the American healthcare system, and we had a pretty interesting chat about that. Maybe that could be a topic for the future Roundup.
That's great. That's wild. Thanks, Dave. Thank you, Julie. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to learn more about the topics we discussed on today's show, please visit our website at 4sighthealth.com. And don't forget to tell a friend about the 4sight Health Roundup podcast. Subscribe now and don't miss another segment of the best 20 minutes in healthcare. Thanks for listening. I'm Dave Burda for 4sight Health.